Okay, so today I have with me Mr. Warren Thompson, and he's economist by profession, I would say, and he. Well, let me get into it. Let me get into it because there's a lot of things that I want to deal with in terms of what is happening in the economy of Trinidad and Tobago, and people want to know what is happening and how certain things are happening in Trinidad and Tobago. So let me get into it. Good afternoon, Mr. Warren Thompson.
Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon.
And Mr. Warren, tell us, who is Mr. Warren first?
Well, I am trained in economics. I worked at public sector for a number of years before going out on my own as a consultant. That's since 1995, so I've been out on my own in private consultancy, etc. for 25 years at least. I had a brief stint at the House of Assembly, Division of Finance, as the Director of the Fiscal Policy Unit.
Right.
When it was first established in 2006.
Right.
Spent 2 years there. And then I've been on my own and private work since then.
Okay. So you have done work in the sector in terms of advising, in terms of the economy,
yes,
from an economic point of view.
Yes, yes, yes.
Mr. Thompson, there was a report coming out from the FIU stating that $27 billion in terms of suspicious transaction would have passed
Questionable transaction.
or
Yes.
questionable transaction would have gone through the system in Trinidad and Tobago. How is that going to impact on Trinidad and Tobago economy in terms of the treaties that we would have signed? And what does that mean for Trinidad and Tobago in terms of having this money going through the system and what?
Well, there are two levels to that issue, I think. Officially, of course, questionable transactions have to be investigated. Whether or not we have the resources, because it's over 1,000, I think 1,180 something cases, which add up to the 27 billion.
Right.
So it's a large number of cases to investigate.
1,000 something cases.
Different incidents.
Right.
The list and in the report in the paper stated that. So that it's quite a number, it's quite a voluminous amount of cases to investigate. But the important thing that has the greatest impact on the economy is how it affects us in terms of international transactions and international relations, because we have these agreements regarding exchange of information, one with the US and two with Europe.
Right.
And where we can exchange information and don't provide it or can't provide it, it can have repercussions, one for our banking system,
right,
and ultimately the economy. On a different level, on another level, I can use a parallel like with the drug economy. It's an underground, literally it is an underground economy. To the extent of $27 billion, that's a lot of money.
But they talk about that close to the national budget.
National budget is a little more than that.
Yeah, but that's close.
It's a little more than that. 27 is about 50 or 51, I think the last budget. 50.
Right.
So about roughly half the national budget. Right? So that it's an underground economy, and basically, if you look at, I was drawing a parallel with the drug economy, another parallel economy, underground economy. That is what keeps a lot of people employed, if you like, and keeps food on the table for a lot of people. So it's a similar situation I see. But the thing is, it is, as you say, questionable transactions, and in the long run, it is going to be harmful if we can't treat with it effectively.
But
right? As I said, it is a tall order because of remember, this is within the last, I think that report was covering the last year and a half or the last 2 years.
yeah, it would have been covering.
But remember, there would be cases. There would be cases before that on their plate.
Right. No, but if it is that you have 20, because last year the financial would have been, well, it would have been 2019, it would have been 2018 to 2019. I think the FIU, because I have the report, the entire document, and I think it was nearly over 1 point something billion at that time.
Right.
No,
so that means that there's been a tremendous increase and
well, in terms between COVID,
right.
no.
Right, and this is usually when you have, you see, you usually see incidents like these when an economy is in recession and when an economy is in a downturn, as we are, and then it has been exacerbated, of course, worldwide by the COVID pandemic. So you usually see an uptick in things like Ponzi schemes. Remember last year there were Ponzi schemes and pyramids. Well, they were calling them susu and susu. Right. So you see an uptick in those kinds of things where whenever, I remember in the mid to late 80s, there was a similar outbreak, if you like, of Ponzi schemes as well. But in those days the name was pyramid. So you usually get these kinds of financial schemes when you have an economy that is in a downturn and where things begin to slow down and so on. And people find solutions to the financial problems.
But my question is, and I really have to ask this question, we saw where one person, basically, the police would have gone after.
Which you're referring to the DSS?
The DSS.
Yes.
But outside of that, I haven't heard nobody else being arrested, charged for money laundering, or being charged for fraud in these instances. In terms of, I haven't seen it. And it makes you wonder, then what is the priority in terms of catching people who are involved in white-collar crime? Because there is a dangerous thing to the economy, and here it is, you have these people doing this in this economy and basically getting away scot-free, it looking like.
Yes. And your concern is mine as well, and I really, from the point of view of an economist, that is more a policing matter and a national security matter. As I said, the number of incidents, the number of cases in that FIU report, over 1,000, almost 1,200 cases, is a huge volume. And do we have the manpower and the resources to investigate all these cases? And that is a real issue, because if it continues to mushroom and get out of hand like that, it can have, but sooner or later, once these things not valid, they turn out not to be valid, turn out to be suspect, a lot of people could lose their wherewithal, lose their incomes, lose their businesses, and so on. So it is something to be very concerned about. It's something that we should be all very concerned about.
Well, I know the government would have passed a legislation where they could have seized your assets.
Yes.
And if you have suspicious transactions and certain things. I haven't seen that even in this case and all that on. So I'm really concerned, because if it is that you have an underground economy striving better than the economy in a COVID, then one has to ask the question.
The thing is, at what point do they intersect and merge in the one with the other? And that is the real thing, because you call it what you call it, laundering in some cases, or you have businesses setting up as fronts for underground activity. And at what point underground activity becomes legitimate activity, and how are you able to discern what is what and which is which? And that is really, that's a real problem. But in reality, and this is where the difficulty comes in, because in reality, money changing hands business booming, as it were. People are being employed, but it is albeit due to underground activity.
Unregulated money.
Right.
So
it is not an easy task. It is not an easy task, and I don't envy those in authority. I don't envy them at all, because you see, we can sit in an armchair as we are now and pontificate and come to conclusions and make judgments. But if you finalize it comes down to reality. And the reality is that those kinds of activities proliferate in times like these, and they keep people above the ground, some people's heads above the ground, and some actually flourish. Right? And that is the reality of the thing. That is the reality of the thing.
All right, but Trinidad economy right now, where are we basically in terms of?
Well, we're still contracted. The economy is still contracting. I was just looking at some GDP data from the last central bank bulletin, economic bulletin for January 2021. And the economy continues to contract, although at a slower rate, but it is still contracted. The government has, for the first quarter of this fiscal year, which is October to December, reported a shortfall of, I think, about $1 billion in revenue, in revenue collections. So it is a very, very trying time. It's a very difficult time still. What is hopeful? What presents some hope is the fact that on the international market, oil prices have been hovering around $70. Have gone up since the beginning of the year, 2021. Have gone from around $40 to around $70.
Right.
And I've been looking at some of the analysis and the predictions for the rest of the year. And there is, from both the EIA, which is it's an organization which does a lot of the oil forecast and analysis out of the United States. And they're forecasting oil can possibly get to $100 a barrel again this year. From a few factors, mainly the OPEC plus grouping, who have been managing output and restricting output to keep prices. Secondly, that...
but they are cartel.
Yes, well, the OPEC plus Russia and so on. And they have been coming together and agreeing, and they've been able to restrict production and therefore maintain prices at a certain level. Also, the summer is coming. The summer months in the northern hemisphere, where the major markets is coming, and the U.S. economy and some of the northern economies are showing tentative signs of recovery. So with the demand for fuel in summer, which is the time when you do a lot of motoring and all sorts of things, those are some of the encouraging factors which would push oil prices closer to $100 a barrel. So that, having said that, now that we no longer refine gasoline, but all our production is now exported through Heritage.
Right.
Heritage has been reporting
in profits.
Profits and so on, and surpluses and after-tax profits. We should be clear about that. After-tax profits. I think the last figure I heard was something like $800 million in after-tax profits.
After-tax profit.
Right. Right. I think the Minister of Finance and one of the other ministers alluded to that fact. So that is encouraging for the economy. It would not be enough to turn things around. Remember, we incurred last year a deficit of $16 billion as a result of the COVID, when we had projected somewhere around 6 billion in deficit. It was about $10 billion extra in terms of the budget deficit because of the COVID expenditure and the COVID policies and measures. So that even if oil prices were to climb back to $100 a barrel, it would take some doing, a long way to go before we can actually turn things around on that basis. Now the important thing there is that, and what the government has been doing throughout the COVID crisis last year and now, is trying to keep things stable, keep things steady, while at the same time eliminating waste. So, if I may, the adjustments and the structuring of the whole petrochain is part of that process as I see it. The process now that they are about to undergo or have just begun with WASA is another part of that process.
Well,
where you remove those or you treat with those issues in a head-on way, those issues which have been causing a serious drain on the treasury.
Well, many will argue that that will be what we will call the World Bank or IMF restructuring policies in terms of getting rid of cutting the public service in half or restructuring your companies.
You see, it's dangerous. I know where you're coming from because I've heard it. And it's dangerous to start using making these statements loosely and glibly, because it creates a lot of unnecessary talk and as I call it, foolish talk, and it creates a lot of panic. And in any economy, any kind of economy, you want to build confidence and you want to create stability. Because one of the things about this economy is that there is cash in this economy. There's excess liquidity. I think the average for the monthly average for the last figure is something like 11 billion TT dollars in excess liquidity at the central bank, the most recent figure.
But
so this is money. Excess liquidity is of the commercial banks is money in excess of the required reserves that they are required to hold at the central bank.
Right.
So that with that kind of excess liquidity in the system sitting in the central bank, you want to create an atmosphere that is stable and steady, that inspires confidence and therefore would give the private sector, both internationally and domestically, the incentive or the encouragement to invest. So when you have a lot of glib, loose talk about, oh, this is IMF policy and IMF this and that, and you know the IMF is one of the big boogeymen in terms of the labor rhetoric and development economics rhetoric. You know, the IMF and the World Bank are big boogeymen in this kind of thing. And when people repeat these very loose things,
well, you have economists who say it too, no?
So what I'm saying is this. Look, I have read some of the recent IMF staff reports.
Right.
And many of the recommendations they made to this current administration, the administration disagreed and did not
fulfill them.
Right. Now, we are, one thing we must understand here, the IMF doesn't come to you.
You go to the IMF.
That is how it works. Our country finds itself in a serious balance of payments problem and they can't meet the international commitments. You go to the IMF. Then the IMF, of course, would have been, there's a standard arrangement with all member countries where they visit you and they do staff reports and country reports. But when you go to them and say you need help, then now they tell you what you have to do.
Right.
Now we like all other member countries, we have had these visits, which is done on invitation, by the way.
Right.
Right. They would come in and they would look at all your sectors and they give you a nice report and they meet with all your technocrats and your private sector leaders and etc. and they write their report. But many of the recommendations they have made, our administration did not agree with them. And what this administration, to my mind, has been doing is taking its own medicine, right? Now, since COVID, where really the government has, as I said, last year the budget deficit was $10 billion over and above what was budgeted. The government hasn't sent anybody home. The establishment is still there. But now, the WASA issue, I don't know how close you follow it.
Yes, I'm following it. Overstaffed.
Right, but it had been reduced by 2010 with the previous administration. Some restructuring and some tinkering had been done with WASA, and they had reduced the whole staffing to around 1,800.
But it's still total about 5,000.
But between 2010 and 2015, what happened?
They increased?
Right, but they had a different administration who...
Okay, so you're talking about the previous one before that. Okay.
Right, so obviously who had a different approach to us.
Right.
So it has come back
To hunt them.
to haunt the country again. So you know, now it doesn't mean that that restructuring would automatically mean sending hundreds of thousands of people home. But you have to allow the new management or the new arrangements and so on to take effect. I've heard the new, well, he's the, how should I call him? He's the CEO, executive director, all in one, who has now full control of things. He made a very, what I thought was a very, very interesting statement where he said he sent around a circular to the staff.
Right.
And asked for recommendation what they thought should be done. And apparently he was very pleased and impressed with what was recommended from within, from the employees themselves.
Right.
So just assume and go running, mouthing off and saying that IMF type this and that and go send over everybody and the bull will come to an end and government wicked and all this kind of thing. To me it is very irresponsible to be making those kinds of comments in this time. But what we have to do and continue to do is to hold things together, keep things steady. But that is what inspires confidence. Right. When you have industrial unrest, when you have social unrest, when you have a fluctuating currency, when you have inflation rates going up and up, all these things are quite negative and they do inspire confidence, they do inspire investment. They do encourage investors to come in. We have been maintaining a very, very steady, stable situation, albeit contracted, obviously because of the COVID pandemic. And that is international. A lot of what we are doing here, everybody else in the world is faced with the same problem and doing more or less the same thing. The new US administration, new President Biden, he's trying to push through a stimulus package of $1.9 trillion US.
Yeah.
That is basically pumping money into the system. He ain't sure he won't get anything back. But he understands that the economy has an economic collapse.
But let me ask you this question. Liquidity. So we keep hearing liquidity and there's a large amount of money in the system that nobody not basically borrowing the same. But I don't think it's that they're not borrowing. But to the average man, what is this liquidity? What we would call liquidity? Because
I like it. Because to the average man, that really doesn't mean anything.
No, because
no, to the average, yes. People like to use this average man. It's whether in the morning you have a job, whether at the end of the month you could pay the rent and buy food. And take care of all those commitments. And I have no statistical or empirical evidence to support it, but you're living here and you're going about your business every day. And you get an impression that many people just barely stay afloat.
Right.
Right? So those issues about liquidity at the central bank are really issues for the managers of the economy and the managers of industry, because that eventually would trickle down to the average man. But while it is there, that it means nothing if at the end of the month or the end of the fortnight you can't meet your commitments.
Right.
Right, and that is the story for thousands and thousands of households and individuals in this country.
So while there may be this talk about, because everybody thinking liquidity, why the government have money?
Not the government, no.
So who has this liquidity?
Those are deposits by businesses and individuals at commercial banks, held at the central bank in excess of what is required. If you remember last year, during the height of the COVID lockdown, in the early stages rather of the COVID lockdown, the central bank announced that in an effort to boost economic activity and stimulate economic activity, and business activity to be precise, they reduced the requirement from 17% of deposits to 14%.
Right.
Which freed up, I forget how many billion, but when you looked at the figures, it didn't move. All that happened is that because you reduced the percentage, it just made more money available, but it's still there in the central bank.
So it would mean
meaning that
nobody gonna take nobody taking the loan.
Exactly what it right.
Or are they or is the commercial bank and what I wanna do, I wanna go into.
You see, here's the thing with that, banks are risk averse entities. Right? It's like a scorpion. He won't bite you. Banks are risk averse entities. That is what they are. They're not taking any risk because outside there the economy is slow.
But you have a liquidity.
Right, that has nothing to do with it. There, as a bank, they know how their loans, the loans that they have in their portfolio, how those loans have been performed.
Right.
They understand very clearly through interaction with their loan clients from what is happening in the economy.
Right.
They're not going to take any added risk if they're not confident that the money will come back in terms of loan repayments. So they're not taking that risk. That is the nature of banking and bankers. The people that take the risk are investors themselves, where you take your own money and invest it, or the government spends the money itself through the budget and the capital, what they call the development program, or the capital expenditure part of the budget. Right?
I want to do a next part of this, a part 2 in this. Because I want to look at this word banging around the place called liquidity. And why it is that if we have so much money in the economy, why, I think we stop it.
You stop?
Yeah, I think we stop. But let me make sure. Let me make sure.